Hey, peace and love, peace and love. This is Brother Garfield. Today's day number 2 in 20 for 20. And it's going to be a wonderful interview. I hope you guys check it out and share, tell a friend to tell a friend, and let's get it in, man. And this is going to be a beautiful interview. This is about the Igbo Jews and the court ruling of making the Igbos in Nigeria actual recognized by the entire world. All right. All right. So now that we have that going and everybody's here, I want everybody to actually share the show. The 10 groups are share the show on your timeline, do something to promote the show. And here we go, ladies and gentlemen. This is the interview. Hey, peace and love. This is Brother Garfield. Of course, we're doing the February is Black History Month here in North America, and we're doing a 20 for 20 scholar program where we have 20 scholars, pretty much 20 days. It might go over 20 this year. I might do actually 30 scholars. But one of the gentlemen who I've been admiring for almost 2 years, he goes by the name of Doctor. Let me put the doctor in front of it. Yehonatan Elazar De-Mota. And I'm going to ask him to pronounce his name, so because I know I probably got it wrong. So I'm going to make sure my brother comes on and explain who he is. But this gentleman is well qualified. He has a doctorate degree. He obtained his doctorate degree in June 2021 in international law from the University of Amsterdam. He also has a master's in religious studies and anthropology. He has a BA also in liberal studies, and he has been ordained as judge of Jewish law. They call it Dayan, and by Hakam Mordecai Levi de Lopez. So this gentleman is extremely qualified to talk about his history, about Jews, and so forth. So we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about Jews in the diaspora. We're going to talk about the Igbos and the ruling. But we also, most importantly, I felt this gentleman's life, as far as who he is, where he was born, and how his upbringing in the Sephardic services, Sephardic history, and so forth, would be perfect for the 20 for 20. So I want to say first and foremost, let me introduce you guys again to Dr. Yehonatan Elazar De-Mota. If I pronounce it, please forgive me, my brother. I don't want any grievances between us. So you could tell us how you pronounce your name, how we could get it in.
Thank you so much for having me here, Brother Garfield. I think you did an excellent job on pronouncing my name, Yehonatan Elazar De-Mota. So, great job.
All right. So for 2 years, almost 2 years, I've been actually researching you, and I found your life so fascinating. And people might say, "Why Garfield? Who is this guy?" I want you to tell folks first of all who you are and what organizations you're a part of, and what do you represent at this moment in time.
Okay, so I guess I can start with where I was born and my education and all of that. So I was born in Miami, Florida, in 1981 to a Dominican Sephardic Jewish family, which migrated to the United States, to Miami in the 1970s by way of Puerto Rico. My parents were both born in the Dominican Republic, and they migrated to Puerto Rico in the 1972, I believe. And then in 1978, they moved to Miami, and that's where I was born. And in Miami, I was educated in Jewish tradition with my family, and I did all my studies and learning there. I participated in the Jewish community, the Sephardic community called Magen David Sephardic Congregation in North Miami Beach, under the tutelage of Chacham Yosef Ben Arosh. He was from Morocco, from Tangier, Morocco, so that's Spanish Morocco. And we used to study every day in Spanish and in Hebrew. And so these are the two languages we were learning. The history, I'll tell a little bit about my family history. My great grandparents, they came from Curaçao and from Portugal and Morocco and Algeria. Before that, I've been able to trace the family history back to Portugal, Spain and Portugal, back to At least the Spanish family, El Azar family, goes back to the 12th century in Spain, to the kingdom of Aragon. The ancestor of that, or the patriarch of that family, his name was Al-Azar, which means God's help in Hebrew. And the De-Mota family is from Portugal. I was able to trace it back to the 1600s. And other families from my mom's family, like the Cohen de Lara family, are also from Portugal. That's the Lara. Lara is a small town in the province of Monção in northern Portugal. And because of the Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews that happened in the medieval time period, my ancestors had to leave those Iberian territories, and they went to France, they went to Italy, and they went to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam. And from Amsterdam, then they made their way all the way to the Caribbean. And the families from North Africa, from Algeria and Morocco, they also made their way to the Caribbean and South America, Venezuela, and from there to the Caribbean.
Right.
And so that's a little bit about my family history. My education, as you said, everything is correct. I love to study, and as you know, I move around a lot. In the last 20 years, I've lived in 7 countries. Well, I would say 6 countries, and so on an average, every 3 to 4 years, I go somewhere else, and that has to do a lot with the work that I do, with the various organizations that I work with, and the type of community service that I do. So in 2007, I started to re-interact with the Dominican Jewish community. I wanted to know what was left after the time of Trujillo, who was the dictator for about 30 years in the Dominican Republic, and he was killed in the 1960s. And in the early 70s, that created a huge political problem in the country, and that's why my parents left the country. It was not stable, it was dangerous. And so I wanted to go back and see what are Jews doing there. Mm-hmm. And so I found, to my surprise, that many of the Jews living there were very assimilated to the normal Dominican or general culture. Some families were still practicing some form of Judaism. So to make a long story short, 2 years later, I was in contact with different leaders of the Sephardic community there. And 2 years later, so in 2009, I decided to move there. And I lived there for 4 years. I moved there and I started to organize the Sephardic Jews in the entire country into a big community in Santo Domingo, in the capital. I managed to educate hundreds of Jews, and out of that group, 3 of them today are rabbis. So my goal became a reality of starting a school and giving life to the Jews in this country. Today in the Dominican Republic, we have kosher or slaughter shochet, as we say in Hebrew, who are certified in order to slaughter animals according to the laws of the Torah. And so I trained 4 people to do that. And so now we have vibrant Jewish life in the Dominican Republic. And after I finished that work, I went back to the United States and I started to pursue my master's degree in anthropology, mm-hmm. and religious studies at Florida International University. And during those 2 years, I decided to go back to the Dominican Republic to do my field research. And what I did there was I produced a book from the research on Los Banilejos. The Banilejos are people who live in a city called Bani. It's the 3rd most important city in the Dominican Republic. Mm-hmm. And they're known for their mangoes. They have 30 types of mangoes.
Okay.
And every year in June, the month of June, they have a mango festival, and people come from all over the world to try all the mangoes. And I was there during that time, and I was able to enjoy all this. And so the Banilejos, according to history, they were descendants of Jews who converted to Catholicism at the time of the forced conversions in Spain in the 15th century. And they managed to go to different places such as the Canary Islands, Portugal, and then they made their way to Hispaniola, which wasn't the Dominican Republic yet. It was Quisqueya, the name in the Taino or Arawak language, and shared with the Haitians. And in the 16th, 17th century, then these Sephardic settlers, they established this city called Bani. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to interview women, particularly women, because Judaism transmit the identity matrilineally. And I wanted to see to what extent do the Banilejos preserve Jewish traditions in their everyday practice, and to what extent are they transmitting these traditions. And part of that investigation, I was able to perform genetic or take DNA from these women, and all this was approved, with signatures and through the university, and it was a really difficult thing to get approved, what's called IRB approval, to be able to do this. And as a result of this genetic study, I was able to show that this community in Bani is connected genetically to the worldwide Sephardic Jewish community. So Jews who are Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Greece, Bulgaria, Turkey, in Israel, they share maternal ancestors with the women in this community in the Dominican Republic. Wow. And so together with the genetics and together with the Jewish customs that they preserve and transmit, and their genealogies as well, which point to the Iberian Peninsula, I was able to develop a method which I called inquisitorial method. So what I did is, in order to be able to perform these interviews, about 70 questions, I read Spanish and Portuguese inquisitorial or Inquisition manuals. So I assumed the position of the inquisitor, asking quite specific questions, right, to get the information. And so what was interesting about this, everyone that I interviewed, the last two questions I will ask would be about if they knew anything about the Inquisition or Santo Oficio, the Holy Office, as we say in Spanish, and if they knew anything about Jewish identity. They all said no. And only two of the interviewees had some notion about
Inquisition.
About the Inquisition, only because they studied in history. But all their customs, the way they slaughter animals, the way they get married, the way they check meat before cooking it, the way they salt the meat and wash it, the way they check their eggs before cooking, like all these details, I in this book, I detailed exactly how Jewish law is saying the same exact thing. So what I tried to prove from this book is that to develop a method in order to establish what in Jewish law we call hazakah. Hazakah refers to legal presumption. So there are four principles which I expound on in this book. It's called discovering the hidden identity of los Banilejos. And if you read that, that's based on my master's thesis. Okay. And so after I did that, then I started an organization called the Obadiah Alliance. And I'll tell you how that started. So the Obadiah Alliance started as the result of fighting. And when I say fighting, I mean literally like almost throwing blows. I'm from Miami. I know how to get down. I went to Israel in 2012. I had been there many times to study, and one of my trips, while I was studying there in 2012, I spoke to a Rosh Yeshiva, which is, for those of you who don't know, Rosh Yeshiva is the dean of a rabbinic ceremony. I spoke to him about the type of work that I was doing in Latin America and how according to Jewish law, we can establish certain populations and people to be Jews without the need of doing giyur, to go through a form of conversion.
Mm-hmm.
He looked at me like I was crazy. And the reason why he looked at me that way is because he is functioning from the point of view of Israeli political or politics, the way they establish who is a Jew in the state of Israel. Anybody that knows me knows that I am an avid student of law.
Mm-hmm.
I love the law, and I don't play games with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was confronted with this reality of a rabbi who is a leader of the Jewish people in Israel, who basically told me there are no principles in politics and in business. He basically told me that he sells himself for his political purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And that made me go into I would say like a depression for about 6 months. So I went back to the Dominican Republic, and one day I had an epiphany, and I said, you know what? If these guys were able to develop their own worldwide global network with their sponsors, their rabbis, their boards, and all that, I could do the same thing. And that's what I did. I contacted various rabbis, various colleagues around the world, and I shared my mission with them. I shared my mission and my vision and legal perspective of how I work. And surprisingly, I found others who were also thinking along the same lines. Mm-hmm. And so we created this board of rabbis called the Obadiah Alliance. And the reason why it's called Obadiah, as we started, is because of the prophet Obadiah in the Bible, which speaks about the exiles of those Jews from Sephardic, from Iberia, who will come back to the Holy Land. Mm-hmm. And under the Obadiah Alliance since 2015, I've been working around the world with various Jews in different communities to not only reintegrate them to the Jewish people, but more than that, to educate them to be independent and self-sufficient. So that means training them in Jewish law, training them in slaughtering, training them to not have to go look for some rabbi to come to them from Israel or from the United States. Because when you do that, then you have to sell yourself or some of your values. Wow. And so that's how the Obadiah Alliance started. Now, during my time at FIU, when I was studying anthropology, religious studies, I met a fellow from the Igbos named Remy Ilona.
Okay.
Remy Ilona. But before I met him, I had known about the Igbos. I mean, I was exposed to the Igbos in high school when I read a book, Equiano's Travels.
Okay.
And I found that to be interesting, but I never investigated more about that until I met Remy Ilona. And Remy did a marvelous work. What he did was he went to all the elders of various Igbo clans, the north and the south, and he interviewed all these elders on all their Omenala customs. And he organized all of these customs, and in the form of ethnology, linking them to biblical customs, he demonstrated then what they do for marriage, what they do for circumcision, what do they do for ritual slaughtering, what do they do for divorce, all these different details, kind of in the way I structured my book on the Banilejos. And also, he included in one of his books called Hebrew and Igbo Republics, he included some genetic studies on the Igbos that have been performed. Now, during the time when he was writing that book, there was a group of so-called Messianic Jews who were performing a genetic study in Nigeria. And then they published an article and they said, oh, these people have no links at all to the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
When I saw that, I said, this is bogus. Because my first question was, what is Jewish DNA? What is Jewish DNA? That's the first thing. What is Jewish DNA? Now I'll tell you what. I have friends who are geneticists, professional geneticists, and I actually consulted them when I wrote my book because of the genetics included in my study. And I had to read about 50 articles just to learn the language and learn how all this works, and go to many conferences on genetics. And I learned that the DNA that's sold commercially by these companies, 23andMe, My Family Tree DNA, My Heritage, most of it is what's called autosomal DNA.
Mm-hmm.
And autosomal DNA is not an exact science. So that means that because of mutations happening over hundreds and thousands of years, you might match with people who are not actually your family. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I saw interesting is that companies like 23andMe and Family Tree DNA had a category at the time. Now they have evolved, they have changed a bit. They had a category called Jewish DNA. And I discovered that Jewish DNA meant Ashkenazi Jew.
Mm.
Ashkenazi Jew. And what that means is that because this community, the Ashkenazi Jews living in the Pale settlement, they were forced to live in a particular region for over 30 generations. They were marrying amongst themselves.
Okay.
And I went to a conference in Israel where I presented my study, and I also learned about different anthropologists and geneticists who did similar studies around the world. And I was shocked that to hear and to learn that there were over 30 genetic disorders among Ashkenazi Jews. And the reason why is because of so much of inbreeding for so
right.
So long.
When you say, one second, when you say disorders, you're talking about, just to be clear for the audience, you're talking about like medical disorders or disabilities. Yes. And you know, it's amazing. I used to work for a Jewish company called FEGS and the Jewish Board of Family Children Services. And this address, FEGS, was funded by Felix and Paul Warburg, who were financiers during like the 20s and the 30s. And they actually set up these homes in America, particularly for people with disorders of disabilities. And that comes from a lot of inbreeding, or there's a word that they use. They're endogenous culture, and they marry amongst themselves. And but let me ask you this though.
Yes.
See that we're talking about that. Do you see that? And give me a straight answer. I don't see that with the Igbo culture. I don't see that with the Igbo culture. And you may have that information, I don't. But go ahead.
According to what I know from the Omanana defenders or the Omanana elders that I'm in contact with, the Igbos traditionally they only marry with other Igbos.
Right.
Now, what that means is that doesn't mean that they cannot introduce non-born Igbos into their culture. They can. They can introduce them. They have a ritual for introducing someone into the culture. The Igbos transmit their tradition patrilineally. Right. But the women that they marry, they become Igbo. So that means that an Igbo man can just marry a woman from Yoruba or Ewe or Fulani or Hausa. You know, and then the children are raised in those traditions. They're raised as Igbos.
Hey, let me ask you this before we get back to some I had some questions that I had some of my partners put together, and some of these questions are very interesting, and I think one of the things that before we even get into the questions, I'm gonna do that for the last probably 10 minutes. We could do the questions a little rapid fire stuff, but when you were born in Miami, and people need to understand this because they feel like if you claim you are from a person who is Hebraic or Jewish, they feel like you have to have the same history as what they claim. So I want to make it clear that you're born in Miami, your family's from Dominican Republic.
Yes.
They came in you trace your roots back to the 12th century of the Common Era, which I find in the quote unquote Hebraic or Jewish community is very common. I see people do it all the time. There's the Vaz family in Jamaica, which they trace to Curacao and the Holland and all that stuff, and they had the same genetic stuff. And some of them were plantation owners, some weren't, and so forth, or slave owners. I'm sorry. So we see this going on in this community, but in America, African Americans who decide to say, "Hey, you know what? We are the chosen of God." They keep saying that these Jews are the fake Jews. Now, let me ask you a question, and we're going to get down to this because this has to be said publicly. Your history, your family never came over as slaves. Your family came over. How did they come over?
Okay, good question. So my family came over from Iberia and North Africa as merchants, or as political refugees, as I explained in the beginning, and that's what we're doing. And when I traced the family, and I saw two things repeating over and over in every generation. Apart from patterns and names, we have in our family military officials, captains, generals, and we have also merchants. And when you're working in commerce, in international commerce, you're always going to be moving around from place to place. And I'll tell you what, and I will say this straight out, and I'm not ashamed to say it because I have come to terms with it.
I know what you're about to say. Go ahead, say it, brother.
When I wrote my book on my PhD in sound legal consciousness, and I did all the research, and I went to archives, I was shocked within the first 3 months to discover that I descend from slave traders.
Wow.
My Jewish ancestors, not all, the Mota family, they were slave traders. And I found the ships that they used, and I found those records. And when I saw that, I started to cry. And I actually had to put away my research for a number of months, and I had to contact I contacted one of my mentors, Rabbi Isaac Sassoon, who lives in New York, by the way. And when I posed my question to him, he said to me, Yehonatan, you have to decide whether you're going to be an activist or an academic. You can't do both at the same time. So that made me think, and I said to him, but Rabbi, how can I don't want to expose these dirty clothes, our dirty clothes, to the nations for them to say, oh, look what Jews are doing. You know? And he said to me, you can't do activism and academia at the same time. You have to be a scholar or you have to be an activist. You can't do both at the same time. And so I chose to be the academic and try to be as cold-hearted as possible and without emotion, and just say things as they are. And in the preface of my book, you will read where I mentioned that I came to terms with this. I'm going to expose the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'll tell you that one of my ancestral communities in Amsterdam, the Portuguese community, I presented twice at the synagogue on my research. And some of the members, when they saw me there, they said, hey, what are you going to do today? And I told them what I was doing. And they were like, oh, you're going to talk about the dark pages of our history. And I said, well, someone has to talk about this. And every time I tried to talk about this and confront some people about it and say, you know what, we need to do something about this, they said, oh, no, that's not my problem. That's not my fault. That's in the past. We're not held responsible for what our ancestors did. And this book, Nasan Legal Consciousness, is my response to these atrocities. Now, I will say this. There have been those who have claimed that Jews are the ones who are responsible solely for the African or the transatlantic slave trade. And I will say that this is false. The reason why this is false is because Jews who were trading, they were not able to do this alone. They had under with the West
Spanish crown, right? The Spanish crown was have to get
Spanish crown, Portuguese crown in West Africa, and in the Protestant countries, in the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, they had help from Christian, whether they're Protestant or Catholic, they work together with the African kingdoms in West Africa who were selling the enemies of their kingdoms to the Portuguese. So this is something. This is what I say in my conclusion in my book, that the transatlantic slave trade is an amalgamation. An amalgamation is like in the Caribbean we have a dish we call sancocho, which is like a ox stew. Jamaica, right? You have the ox stew. You have the mixture of the meat with the potatoes and eggs and all this. This slave trade was like an ox stew, un sancocho. You had all these different elements happening. What I wanted to do was to demonstrate the Portuguese Jewish contribution to the legal debate and how their contribution to this legal debate made it legal to trade people and to practice slavery.
Now this is where I'm kind of confused, because for one, I'm gonna be honest with you, I'm not sold on the whole Igbo thing yet. I'm not sold at all. But what I do find is that, do you feel that just like how your family moved to Santo Domingo, or your family moved to Senegambia, Sephardics moved there and they mixed the little Luso African stuff.
Right.
Who you think in Nigeria, specifically in Igbo land, that you could make a case that they were folks that were actually moved into the area and may have influenced them, and they just carry that tradition on? Is that one of the possibilities that you have presented?
I don't present that, but what I do say is the following: in my studies on the Igbos, there were definitely Portuguese Jews who went into the region, such that the rabbis of the Portuguese Jewish community in London in the 18th century, right, they were aware of the Igbos.
Was it 18th century or 1800s?
It was 1700s.
1700. Okay, thanks for the clarity.
So there's you have the rabbi of the Portuguese community in London, Rabbi Rafael de Mendola. He wrote a letter. So Jews were traveling because they were trading, always trading. They were traveling into the region and contacting people and seeing what people are doing and whatnot, and slaves as well from that region were going into Europe. So they know what's going on. One of the questions that was referred to the rabbis often was what to do with those slaves, those male slaves coming from Africa who were already circumcised. And that's a big issue. And why is that a big question? Because in Jewish law, as I wrote, I'm going to try to summarize as easy as possible. It's very complex material or concepts, legal concept. In Jewish law, in slavery, when we talk about slavery law, when you take a Jew takes a slave, a male slave, there's a ritual that the slave owner has to perform on upon purchasing the slave, which is a ritual immersion. In Hebrew, call it tebilah. And what this does is it makes it possible legally, according to Jewish law, for a Jew to own a slave. If you don't do that, you cannot have that person as your slave. And what this does is it prepares this slave to eventually become a full-fledged Jew and be integrated into community. Now, because the Jewish tradition is voluntary, it cannot be forced like Christianity or Islam that goes to places and conquers and say, oh, you are now part of us. Judaism has to be accepted voluntarily. Then if the slave says, no, I don't want to be a Jew, then after 12 months, Jewish law says that slave has to be sold to the Gentiles, to the non-Jews. And a Jew cannot purchase that slave again. That's what Jewish law states. Now, part of that ritual immersion is the process of circumcision. As I said, this process presents the possibility for the male slave to be integrated as a full-fledged Jew after a period of 12 months. So after 12 months, the slave now becomes a full-fledged Jew and member of the community. And we have much material published on this fact already. in Amsterdam and West Africa and Suriname and many places in the Caribbean. So many of these slaves that made their way all the way to Suriname, slave owners who came from Amsterdam and Italy and Curaçao and Brazil in the 17th century, they sent questions back to the rabbis in Amsterdam saying, hey, we have slaves here who are circumcised. What are we going to do with them? And why is that a question? Because if they are circumcised, there's a doubt that they might be Israelites.
But don't you have to take into consideration that they had circumcision at a young between I think George Baston was one of the first guys, Igbos in Nigeria that pointed that out, although it was before. And he said that they could have been circumcised between the first day and the 8th day in his book. But also that I was reading another article by a PhD talking about them also circumcising females. So if they circumcise females, I don't think they practice that anymore. But they used to in the early 1900s, and it's a part of their tradition and history. I am saying if that's the case, they and we know circumcision that they do is nothing like the circumcision that they do with the Hebraic culture. So is it possible that these people were being circumcised, like they have up until like the age 15, some people were being circumcised? So wouldn't that be a counteraction? Not that I want to counter what you're saying, because I'm actually interviewing you right now, but for the audience, because there's a lot of Igbo folks that call me after I do this interview. Like, why did you ask this? Why did you ask? All right, this is how I feel. I feel there was a Hebraic contact with the culture, and usually it goes even further with the caravan trade. We look at the caravan trade from the Arab trade and the Islamic time period. You have the Taoud community, which is closer than Morocco, and they were traveling back and forth. They call them the Rothschilds of the day. So I'm saying that there must have been contact with, whether it's Timbuktu, whether it's Niger, whether it's all these different places, because of trade. You're gonna have exchange of ideas, and also you had Berbers, because Berbers, you know, they change their religion depending on who's in control. They had the Christians, they were Muslims at one time, they were Jews. I'm saying that's how the religion is being brought into the African culture and tradition. And of course, if you're the person who is trading, more than likely you have the money, so you're looked upon as superior at times also. Because
people want to be part of your community.
Right. So and then also when I have a book right here. It's called, I think this is it right here. I think I have it right here. This book right here, The Letters of Medieval Jewish Traders.
Okay.
They did not want to actually do trade with people who are not Jewish. So they would convert you and say, I'm not doing it because I want you to go by the laws I go by. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt. So if I'm going to give you money and goods, I want to make sure that we there. You know what I'm saying? So with this book here, this actually shows them going all over and letters being written to all. I think that letter from London is actually here too. But the issue I have is that the Igbos were practicing certain things already that I wouldn't call it Jewish per se, but they were practicing circumcision, which was all over Africa before. So that's what I would say to that. But the Igbo stuff, let's delve into that a little bit. A decision was made, I think, February 2022. How basically your work, your life's work has come into fruition with the Igbo people claiming that they have a Jewish connection. How recognized is this, and is this something new that, and is it still an ongoing battle to get the Igbo in the larger community? Because I think that's the bigger fight right now. But go ahead and elaborate.
Okay. Wow, very good question. So yeah, you have two questions there. So the first one is how recognized it is, and the second one is how is it an ongoing thing? So I would say the following: in 2017, I went to Liverpool in the UK. I was invited to speak with the chief of about 1 million Igbos in the UK. They are organized according to clans, and they have leaders. Kind of what you read in the Bible, in Exodus chapter 19 with Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, having leaders above the tens, the thousands, hundreds. And so they have one leader who's on top of all of them. And they're organized in this way. I was invited to speak with him. And I told him about my investigations. And when I told him about my investigations and what I thought, he smiled and he looked at me. He went into his cabinet and he took out a kola nut. And he explained to me and the people who were there what this kola nut meant in Igbo culture. And then he gave me a piece. I didn't know what that meant at that time until afterwards, that the kola nut ceremony means you are one of us and we are part of you. We are brothers. They don't do the ceremony with outsiders. And so I understood that he saw me as a fellow brother Israelite Igbo. And the next day, they were having their monthly gathering with all the leaders coming from all the cities from the UK, Reading, Leeds, London, from everywhere. And I was invited to present my research findings to them. And I'll tell you, brother, this was such an emotional time for me, because when I started to present my evidences, what I thought from a Jewish legal perspective and anthropology, all the leaders unanimously, they stood up, they do their meeting in Igbo language, then they translated into English and said, we've been waiting for you. We've been waiting for you to tell us, to recognize what we already knew.
Wow.
That's what they said to me. And then they added something. They said, and perhaps you are our salvation for what's happening in Biafra and Igbo land. And then I understood that they are at war to preserve their lands, to be independent, to practice their culture. Omenala means what you do in the land. Their tradition is based totally on the land, which is exactly what the Torah is talking about. All these mitzvot, which depend on having the land, they have the same exact notion that the people are connected with the God and connected with the land. This is essential to the Jewish tradition. Now, after having that meeting and being in this ongoing conversation with the Igbos, I then came to understand that there are more traditions, more customs, which I put together and created kind of a dossier, a file. And when I look at the file, I look at all these things, then I was able to make a ruling according to Jewish law. According to, as I explained before, in the case of the Banilejos, I implemented the legal presumption on the Igbos. And basically what the ruling states is that based upon the anthropological studies, the historical studies, the genetic patterns, the customs, and the sociology of the Igbos, we can presume legally in the same exact way that all Jews are Jews today, presuming that we are descendants of Abraham and of Moses and of Ezra, as in the Bible. The Igbos also have a claim to Israelite identity as such. And because of the situation of the forced conversions to Christianity and the colonization in Igbo land, those Igbos who are Christians today, they should have the rights to return to their Omanana culture and be accepted as brother Israelites, just as born Jews. That's what the ruling states.
Right.
I know many people, because what happened was the English ruling was released first, and that went everywhere. But the ruling in Hebrew, when a Bet Din or a Jewish tribunal issues a ruling, it is issued officially in the Hebrew language for other rabbinic authorities to read it. And because this is the rabbinic language, this is the legal language in Hebrew. And the Hebrew document details in rabbinic language and argumentation, which we call in Hebrew melissa. It describes and argues why on each one of these points, the Igbos are not only, according to Jewish law, according to Hazakah, not only are they Israelites, but those who have converted to Christianity should be able to be reintegrated into the Igbo culture as Israelites without the need of a conversion.
Mm.
As such, because they are Israelites, they should be able to marry with Jews
Okay.
without a need of conversion. That's the ruling.
But so what about the larger audience? How are they feeling about this? Because I know
Okay.
that's patrilineal.
Yeah.
They're matrilineal. So how they respond? I know you're getting some pushback now from the bigger heads.
Yes.
But what do you do right now in this situation?
So what's going on is the following, and I will say this: in the Jewish tradition, there is conversion. People convert all the time. The Jewish people, we all look different from each other because we have been converting mainly women, local women, wherever these Jewish traders have been traveling throughout generations. They convert local women into the community in the very same way that the Igbos are doing, integrating women into their community. So the fact that the tradition is transmitted patrilineally in the Igbo culture, it is still, at the end of the day, it's still functioning in the same exact way in terms of Jewish law. So there's practically no difference there, because also in the Jewish tradition, there's also patrilineal descent. You have Kohanim, you have Levites, and the priestly lineage, and then you have the tribal lineages like Judah, Benjamin. All this comes from the paternal lineage. And when we talk about inheritance of land, tribal inheritance, this is all patrilineal. So at the end of the day, because of the endogamous practice, we can presume that there's no mixing of bringing people who are not part of this circle. There's no such thing as a pure Israelite blood or pure Jewish blood. That notion is false. We have proven it genetically even. So the fact that Igbos are integrating, let's say, non-Igbo women who are not born Igbo into the culture, and they will introduce them into the culture, that is equivalent as to what Jews are doing, integrating women by way of conversion into their culture. So there's no difference there. The pushback, of course, the pushback that's happening is that there's a lot of ignorance in the Jewish world. When we look at Jewish education, first of all, there's a lack of study or emphasis on the Jewish Bible. There's a lot of emphasis on the Talmud, a lot of emphasis on rabbinic commentaries on the Torah, but when it comes to history, sociology, anthropology, migratory patterns of Jews, there's a lot of ignorance. I remember, I went to Israel the first time, and people assumed because of my skin color that I'm Ethiopian, because that's what they know. That's what they know.
Yeah.
And I don't blame them, because that's what they know. Now, when I explain my family history and everything, they say, wow, that's amazing. Then they start to click. They're like, that's right, Jews are everywhere. So what's happening is, as this conversation is going back and forth between Igbos and Jews, every week now, what I see is that there's a kind of ideological war between this issue of patrilineal descent, matrilineal descent, and to what extent are they actually Israelites? And what I did with the ruling, and this ruling, I wrote the ruling, but the ruling was presented to 5 other rabbinic authorities, and they unanimously said, this is very well written, we can run with this. Otherwise, it would have never been published. And what I did with the ruling, just for you to understand legally how important this is, the ruling, I cited at the end of the ruling, I cited various authorities, Ashkenazi authorities, Sephardic authorities, but I cited at the end a very important Ashkenazi authority who's known as Hazon Ish. And what the Hazon Ish does in his Aaron, the brother of Moses, as priest, he basically says all priests today, all the Kohanim today, are Kohanim based on legal presumption. Why? Because no one can trace all the way back to the time of Ezra and all the way back to the time of Moses and say, yeah, I am a legitimate descendant of this lineage. And now we have genetics, and what we have seen is that, according to genetic studies, 70% descend or have what's called the Cohen modal haplotype.
Right.
Not 100, 70. So what does that mean? What that means is that some people adopted this lineage without being an actual descendant. That's what that means. So,
all right. You know what? Seeing that you brought up genetics, what is it? Because I talked to Remy Yona like a week and a half ago.
Okay.
And it seems like I'm not clear on his DNA claims. And he refers to you, and I think previously you had referred to him. What is the DNA connection between Igbo and Jews? And before you answer that, I think one of the reasons why we have this quote unquote Jewish DNA talk from a preliminary perspective in the 90s coming out is because most of these communities, like the communities you talked about where you grew up, the communities that you were able to trace back to, most of them pretty much have the J marker. They do. And it's just it's a reality. You know, they could have E1, B1B, they could have a little bit of R, they're going to have it might be GR or whatever, but they have admixtures of primarily what they have in common is most of them have that J marker. So people with that J marker assume that the J marker is primarily for those who might be quote unquote Hebraic or Jewish. Right. So what is the connection with the Igbo with the genetic stuff? How does that come in?
Well, the first thing is we don't have, and that's something that I state in the ruling. We don't have a serious genetic study like what I did in Bani or what Dr. Doron Behar in Israel has done with all the different Jewish communities to show those links. We don't have that. Only thing we have are what are called autosomal DNA, which is what I explained earlier about my heritage, family tree DNA. The autosomal DNA, what it shows is it gives you these percentages of all the people you're matching with within that database. Every database is going to give you a different percentage because of the people who are reporting and how they report their identities within that database. So what's going on is that the Igbos, when you look at various cases of Igbo, and I will say this, according to Jewish law, all you need is to take a sample of a few out of the majority. And in Jewish law, this is called parish, merubah parish, which means when you have a batch of dough, and you take a little bit of that dough, that piece that you extracted from the majority is representative of that majority. Now we know in science, this is not always going to be the case, but this is how Jewish law works. And it's important for people to understand that. And what that means is that if you take 3 or 4 people or 10 people or 100 people and you take them as a study, then to represent the whole, whatever ruling you make or whatever assessment you make of the minority, that's going to represent the majority. That's how Jewish law works. So when we look at the autosomal DNA that has been reported on Igbos, we see 3 things going on. What we see is percentages in 3 main areas. We see in Nigeria a huge percentage, like maybe 80 to 90% in Nigeria and West Africa. Then you see in the Middle East another percentage. And when I say Middle East, I refer mainly to what is Israel, Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, that area. And then you have a third group, which is another population group, which is coming from East Africa. So from Tanzania all the way up to Ethiopia. And this is very interesting. It's very interesting because autosomal DNA, when it's utilized in a batch and compared one to another within the same group of people, you can then learn migratory patterns. And what that means, these three different population groups that keep repeating among the autosomal DNA of Igbos, what that means is that they have a connection to the Middle East, so Israel, Syria, this region. They have a connection in Nigeria, and they have a connection in East Africa, all the way up to Ethiopia, Sudan. What this tells us is that there's a migration happening, and based on this DNA, I was able to, and based on the DNA and the migratory patterns that we have in history, I came to the conclusion that the Igbos came from East Africa, from Middle East, yes, possibly from the time of Jeremiah. It had to have been before the time of Ezra, because that's where the split happened. Jeremiah the prophet told the Israelites, don't go to Egypt, go to Babylon, establish yourselves there, make homes, marry, have children, and then 70 years later, you will come back. But there was a group who said, no, we're not going to Babylon. We're going to Egypt. And they went to Egypt. And this group that went to Egypt later was known in history as the Elephantine Jewish community. This Jewish community then suffered the time period when Christianity came in the 4th century. Those Jews, they had to move. The Elephantine Jewish community, they went westward or southward. Those that went westward established pockets as traders all along North Africa. And then, as you said earlier, interactions with communities. Then they came down into the Niger River by way of the Mali Empire, the Timbuktu, and then they established themselves along the Niger River area. I believe this is the Igbo community. Okay. This is my assessment, my professional expert assessment of this community, and that they have had interactions with Jews coming from Portugal, Jews from Morocco, Jews from Mali, Jews from East Africa who are trading all the way from Yemen, who are trading in this region. People are going back and forth all the time. And as a result of this, what's going to happen is, because women are being introduced into this community, the autosomal DNA is going to bring in DNA that's coming from East Africa. That's what's happening.
Let me ask you this. Seeing that the percentage of the Igbo being from Nigeria is so large compared to, wouldn't it make more sense that the people actually come from Nigeria, just logically speaking, that they come from Nigeria, but people came from outside and mixed with them at a small percentage level? Wouldn't that make more sense based on I'm just saying based off the percentage? Because some of them, I remember a couple years ago, my brother Remy Iona, he had showed his percentages, and I think his percentage of Middle Eastern was 0.2 at the time. Okay. I don't know if it is right now. It may be more now. And I'm saying to myself, why would I? Because I have a majority Igbo in my genetic makeup, as far as, and I did like 9 DNA tests. Okay. I wanted to prove to people that the DNA tests are legit as far as they have the same averages per se. That's what I was trying to prove by doing tests. And what happened is, if my Igbo was, say, for example, 75%, and my Middle Eastern DNA, so-called Middle Eastern DNA, was say 1%, why would I now say I'm definitely from the Middle East and not claim where the majority is from? Is that a good question?
That's a good question. And I would say the following. This type of genetic study, when we talk about percentages in autosomal DNA, is very faulty. And I will say why. Because the DNA cannot tell you where you came from. So this 90%, let's say, or 70% of Igbo DNA, this is just telling you how many people within the database are reporting who are from that place in that database. If you take that same group of people and let's say you social engineer them and move them away to India, just an example, they will report their children who are born in India, when they report in the database, their DNA is going to have that 90% is no longer going to be 90. It's going to migrate to India.
One second. So are you saying that if they have primarily a E1B1A marker, that the E1B1A marker would change if they go to India? Is that
No,
what you're
that's
saying?
not what I'm saying. What I'm talking about is, because what you're talking about is called Y DNA. The Y DNA is DNA that comes by your fathers.
Right.
And the Y DNA mutates every 4 to 5 generations. So that means that your DNA, let's say out of 12 markers, the DNA every 4, so every 4 to 5 generations. So we're talking about 100 to 200 years, 100 to 150 years. Out of those 12 markers, one of them is going to be different. One of them will be different, and so that.
Yeah, but I don't think if they moved in a vacuum it would change, not unless their appearance change. Meaning
Right,
that
and that's what I'm saying. Like
father,
mutations
start mixing with the people over there, then
right.
the autosomal is going to change.
Right,
But,
the autosomal will change once their children mix, and we're talking about 3, 4 generations later. You're going to see a complete change. So, it will be interesting. And this is what I try to tell people all the time. Like when you do these tests, we can't really rely on the autosomal test because they can't really tell you anything. But if you do the Y DNA and you do the mitochondrial DNA, then you can compare. When we talk about comparing population genetics and comparing populations, where we have genealogies and we have, let's say, historical connections between different populations, then we can do something with it. Otherwise, it's in a vacuum or isolated. You can't say, "Oh, I'm a Jew," or "I'm this," or "I'm that," because I connect with these people.
That's fair.
That's dangerous. That's dangerous, in my opinion.
Let me get to one of the things that I enjoy reading that you wrote. Last year December, you wrote an article that got a little backlash from the African Americans here in America. It was an article regarding the Black Hebrew Israelites. You said the BHI claimed that those peoples who came to the Americas and the West Indies are Israelites by virtue of their skin complexion and having been enslaved. While it is true that some of the enslaved were Israelites, the claim that the true Israelites are black is false. So now I want to ask you this.
Yes.
Are you saying that the color, because you wrote in this article something very, very interesting, and I have to actually read it. Very, very interesting. That's going to piss off a lot of people.
I'm sure.
You said the claim and its inverse cannot both be true.
Right.
The converse and the contrast positive cannot both be true. Proof
That's
of
correct.
the inverse. If we assume that the original Hebrews were black and some of them traveled to the European lands and took local wives and had children with them over a period of many centuries, their descendants will have different phenotypes. This statement is true. Proof of the contrapositive. If we analyze the DNA of individuals claiming to be pure Israelites by virtue of their rich melanin content, there are two things to consider. Skin complexion represents less than 1% of the human genome. Blacks are not homogeneous. They are mixed with Native Americans, Europeans, and non-Jewish Arabs. Thus, the contrapositive is also true. I want to talk about two things. One, they do believe in the theory of the Khazar theory. They believe that. So the African Americans who claim that, they believe that as facts. What you just said, they disagree with 100%. They don't believe the Jews went to Europe and slept with women, white women, or whatever we want to call them, and they changed over the years. They don't believe that at all. Two, they believe that majority of the folks that came over on the slave trade were actually Israelites, and they're using Deuteronomy 28. So I want you to address this post that you made that I found fascinating, and I actually loved it. But go ahead, my brother.
Okay. All right. So yes, I came in contact the first time with Black Hebrew Israelites, or they weren't, actually they weren't even called it. They were called just Israelites.
Mm-hmm.
When I was at FIU in my early 20s, so in my undergraduate time period, and I met a brother who was considered himself Israelites. He had the tzitzit, the tassels. He covered his hair. And at that time we didn't have smartphones. We had the phone with the cables. And I remember we used to talk for hours. He used to call me and we would talk. Bible, and I noticed that we had clashes on some theological issues, and the last thing this brother told me was, I'll see you in Jerusalem in the future. And I said to him, okay, amen. And that was the last thing I heard of him. That was my first experience with Israelites. Then as time progressed, I started to realize that there were a lot of different groups all over the United States. And not only United States, when I came to Europe, I saw in England, in the Netherlands, I saw these groups as well teaching on the streets. And so I started to then try to understand what is the main theology. And first thing I have to say is that the Black BHI or Black Hebrew Israelite is not homogenous. There are so many different groups, different theologies. Some are more Christian, some are more, let's say, biblical in that sense. They reject the whole Christian theology. But there is one thing that they share in common, and it is this narrative, as you mentioned, based on Deuteronomy 28, the curse. Mm-hmm. This curse, as a result of violating the contract between the Eternal One and the nation, they will be enslaved and go back on ships back to Egypt. Nobody will buy them. Nobody will want to be with you, or you will be detested and hated from all the nations, and so on and so forth. This is something we read every year as Jews in the Torah in our yearly cycle. Now, I understand that this narrative, this biblical narrative, is appealing to someone who lives in the United States, who descends from the African slave trade, and due to colonialism, and I would say this as an anthropologist, and in my studies in sociology in Latin America, there's a similar experience. And the similar experience is that peoples who have been colonized in these places, they don't know who they are. And because they don't know who they are, then they're trying to find meaning and understanding for themselves by knowing who they are and where they come from. So they take on an identity. The United States is very unique because the United States brought its slaves, didn't integrate with the slaves, with the African slaves. They killed the natives. They put them in concentration camps and reservations, and then created laws to segregate the slaves from the rest of the population. When you do that, and you remove people from their origin, and you erase their history, then that will create that creates trauma, post generation or generational post-traumatic stress, and that's what's happening in this community. And that's why we have Christianity was forced on the African slaves because they were baptized from the slave ports in West Africa already. As you read in my book, they were baptized as Catholics. Later on, the Protestants were like, oh, we don't know if we should baptize them or not. If we baptize them, we have to free them, so we might as well not baptize them. So that was the position of the Dutch Protestants. And so in the United States, you have then this theology of the curse of Ham theory, which contributes to the disenfranchisement and marginalization of the African slaves who are in the country. Mm-hmm. These people are lost. They are suffering. They are fighting for their lives, and they need something to unite them to create an independence. And you know what we have the model? A beautiful model of this? Haiti. People don't know. We don't learn about Haiti in school in the United States. I learned this in the university in political theory and history. Haiti, the Haitian slaves under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture were able to unite themselves through religion, through voodoo. Mm-hmm. They sacrificed the black pig, which represents their matriarch, not the matriarch, but their matron, their matriarch saint, Ezilidanto. And then they made an oath, they made a covenant with this spirit, this ancestral spirit, to say, if you free us we will serve you forever. So in a similar way that the Israelites did with the God of Israel or the God of the Hebrews, making this covenant, this contract, this bilateral contract, God accepts, the Hebrew nation accepts. So the Haitian people accept, they united under one religious consciousness, and they were able to free themselves. And this served as a model for freedom of other enslaved Africans in the entire Caribbean, all the way to Suriname and Brazil and Guyana, and even in the United States. Those Haitian soldiers went to Louisiana as well. And they also went to Venezuela and helped Simon Bolivar fight against the Spanish rule there. So this is history that has been lost. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because this phenomenon of utilizing a religious myth for political emancipation is not new. It's not new. And what the Black Hebrew Israelites are doing is the same exact thing. It's the same exact thing. The problem I see with it is that it is usurping. It's usurping an entire history, entire anthropology, which is documented of the Jewish people. And I understand that in order to construct your own identity, utilizing this myth from the Bible, you need to deconstruct the other's identity. And that's not correct. That's not fair. Instead of doing it that way, I believe that the descendants of the disenfranchised people, according in this transatlantic slave trade, they should first try to find out who they are, find out who you are, where you come from. And once you find that, you will find meaning in your life. You don't need to be Jew. You don't need to be a Muslim, the Nation of Islam. You don't need to be Christian. You just need to find out who you are and find your meaning for yourself. And once you find that meaning, then that is the beginning of emancipation.
All right. I'm going to stop right there, Dr. De-Mota, because I have 11 questions and I never got to ask you one. So I don't want to go into those because that's going to be another hour.
Okay.
But what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the interview at this point and say thank you for taking the time out to do the interview today. Hold on for a little bit. Let me just close out and say to you that it's a pleasure. It's an honor. You are a great mind. And during the interview, I'm going to put up your book so everybody can get an idea what your book is and all that stuff so you can get some promotion. Okay. And continue to do your work. And I might not agree 100% with the whole Igbo thing, but I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to learn. And I'm not here to argue. I'm just here to interview today. All right? Okay. Definitely, you have made a good case for your argument today. Hold on one second. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm still live, but I want to make it clear to you guys that we're actually doing an after show. The link is in the chat right now. I'm going to start that show and we're going to head over there. And tomorrow is going to be part 2 for Rabbi Dr. Yehonatan Elazar De-Mota. Very interesting stuff. We don't have to agree, but we're just listening to hear that point of view. All right. So peace and love. And shout out to Anonymous Hebrew, man. Come on to live, the next live, because I got to say something to you because of what you said earlier. But I'm live right now on my other StreamYard. Y'all could check me out over there. Peace and love, family, and thanks for tuning in. I hope you learned something today. Peace and love.